Hey folks, welcome on in. Today we're going to be going back in time to World War I with this Whippet tank. I am so excited to get into this very old tank with you guys. I actually built this back when I was working on the Panther, just to kind of take a break from all the photo etch I was doing, and I can't wait to share this entire painting and vignette process with you guys. So to start off, we're going to be giving this tank a nice black base coat of primer. Again, this is just going to help us later on because any spots we miss will just be like a dark shadow, especially in the bottom parts of the tank and inside the track. I just wanted to take a moment to show you guys the wonderful textures that we were able to do on this tank. Again, I didn't capture anything on video during the build process, but what I did was all these flat panels, I actually just stippled some thin cement on with a stiff brush, and we got these beautiful steel textures. It looked really nice. So this is a reference photo I actually colorized using an app on my phone, and we can see a clear three-tone camouflage. So that's what we're going to do with this tank. Now, you'll also notice that this is a British tank from World War I, but it had German logos on it, German insignias. So we're actually going to be painting this as a captured German World War I tank. So again, starting with the three-tone camouflage, we're going to do a light pass over all these flat panels with this oil ochre color, which is like a yellow, off-white yellow color, similar to like Dunkelgelb, but it actually is a little bit more yellow than the Dunkelgelb was from the German tanks in World War II. It is interesting to notice that the three-tone camouflage uses the same kind of colors even in World War I already with the Germans, but just slightly different tones to them. So again, we're just going through all of the flat panels with this oil ochre, and we're trying to stay away, just lightly touch the recessed areas, and you can see we get this nice shadow effect. It's kind of like we're already shading it, similar to doing like a white highlight on a black background. So we're going to use a masking putty just like we did on the Panther, and we're going to place this down to cover up what parts we want to stay that yellowish ochre color. And you can see I like to use just kind of something hard and pointy like the end of this flat paintbrush to put things in place. And I actually have another trick I'm going to show you that I learned while I was doing this, but first we're going to look at this dull green color. So what we want to do here is try to paint at a 90-degree angle as much as possible. So in other words, you want to be perpendicular to your tank like I'm holding here. And the reason we want to do this is because we want a soft camouflage. Okay, this was field applied camouflage. This wasn't done in a factory because this was a captured tank. So with that being said, what that means is you're going to have a softer edge, okay? That means that we don't want to have these very hard lines, and how you do that is by placing this masking putty down and then hitting it with paint at a 90-degree angle. It doesn't go underneath the edge of your putty, and then you can actually kind of see the soft edges just looking there. So I wanted to show you guys a little trick that I learned while I was doing this, and it made it actually a lot easier overall. Is I just flatten this thing out like a pancake and then just start pulling at it in different shapes, just kind of randomly, and you get this really nice camouflage pattern that you can just kind of lay down on the tank. I found that this worked so much better this time versus when I did it on my Panther a couple weeks ago. And again, I just really like the results because I kind of did a layout before I started just on the included sheet that shows all the paint colors. It didn't actually show this as an option, so I actually just looked up using that reference photo and just kind of drew on there what I wanted to do. And then I just kind of used it as a guide as I was making these cool random shapes and just putting them down. So I didn't exactly match my reference, but again, I really liked this methodology versus how I did it on the Panther. And you can see the results here as I pull this off. It's coming off a lot easier because it's thinner, and again, for those of you that remember, I mentioned when I did the Panther, I had to leave for work in the middle of my three-tone camo, and the masking got all goopy when I came back home. So this time I painted it all in one sitting, and it came off really nice and clean. I did still have a few little spots where there was like residue or like little pieces left, but it was very, very minor in comparison to when I did my Panther. And these results just turned out great. We have a nice soft camo, And because it's all in the same kind of tone, it really goes well together. And then what we're going to do is highlight this, okay? And again, what I said about trying to keep it all the same in terms of the highlights, trying to make it look uniform, is I'm going to use this cream of ice the entire time to do my highlights with all 3 tones. And I also showed the thinner that I like using, this VMS airbrush thinner, because it just really works well. And we really need to thin the paint down in this case, even though you can still see I was getting buildup over time on the end of my needle and I had to clean it off. But I had my air pressure down at very, very low, and I was thinning this paint down very much so I could get this kind of cloudy, soft look to it. And because I did this, the results were much softer and much more uniform than what they were on the Panther. And again, it's because this was field applied. I wanted to make sure we kept that soft, desaturated look. Again, because we're also going to be, spoiler alert, putting this into a scene. So again, you can see I'm just adding some cream of ice to all of this, and just slowly putting down thin layers. Again, this is very thin down layers of paint over top of the original coats, and you can see how we have this cloudy look, and it's all kind of becoming a uniform color, like it's all the same kind of shade. And what's nice about this is it's like putting an oil dot filter on, but without having to use any oil paints. This was just using the same cream of ice to lighten up all the paint colors, the original paint colors for the highlights. Now the next step here, we're going to take this grime, and again, you guys saw me do this on the Panther. I like to use this ink that's called Grime by Ammo to get all those recesses. And again, it's kind of like a pre-pin wash, if you will, because you're just kind of darkening those areas, and it's a very light ink, so it just gives you a nice grimy look in all those recessed areas that we're going to pin wash here in a moment. So here's what it looks like after we put down that ink grime all over. So the next step is we're going to take this Dunkel ground, we're going to paint everything gray. And again, you'll remember this is kind of a standard step for most tank models, is that you're going to start painting everything gray. And in this case, we're going to paint the guns, we're going to paint these cleats. I'm assuming they're track cleats. I couldn't see any reference images where they were used. I mostly just saw reference images where they were falling off. But then we went over the engineering tools as well. So again, here's more of those cleats. I was wondering if maybe they used them as extra armor, thinking like the tracks from tanks in World War II, how they would lay tracks on the turret and sides, whatnot, just to act as extra armor, but I'm not sure. So moving on to the exhaust, I started with white near the areas where I figured there'd be a lot of corrosion and paint wear, and we're just trying to make some white stripings here. And then the next step is we're going to come back over with the gray, just same Dunkel ground that we used before, just like a steel color. And we're just going to get this area prepped for what we're going to do next, okay? So here we have the second exhaust. We're going to do the same thing, use white first, and then switch over to a nice gray. And I just wanted to do this because the next step is we're going to put some satin varnish down. So one of the things you're going to notice here is that I did not paint the mud guards, so we're going to do that now. And the reason I didn't paint those mud guards, mud flaps, that's what these things were. They were big tarps to just protect as much as possible the mud from flying up on top of the tank. I actually just painted these with a nice Citadel color skeleton horde, which kind of has like a tarpish look to it. And I chose that kind of paint because it doesn't leave a lot of visible tide marks and it flows really well. It's a great color, and it's a great paint for miniatures and whatnot. So next step is we're going to do this pin wash with the German, the brown for dark yellow, and I just think this is such a beautiful pin wash, especially for these three-tone camouflages. It's a nice brown, grimy, dirty hue. And then what we're going to do after we're done putting down some pin washes, go back over with some clean enamel thinner on this brush and just clean up any excess from there, right? And then you can see kind of the top to bottom the difference that that pin wash makes. It really makes those rivets and bolts stand out versus when you don't have it down. And again, it also is great for like panel lining or any kind of edge lining. You can see like this angle on top of the turret. You can see how it brings that entire angle out and makes it pop away from the tank. Again, it also makes them feel a lot larger because you're adding all that depth and shadow around all those little details. Just looks so good after a nice pin wash. There's just something satisfying about that. So going back to the exhaust, now that we have everything sealed up, we're going to switch over to some pigments. And I started with some medium rust. It's kind of like a medium rust. It's not too dark, right? But it's a darker rust. Then we're going to go over it with an enamel wash. Now what that's going to do is that enamel wash has thinners in it, like enamel thinner, right? Enamel thinner and pigment. And it's going to activate that pigment and help it stick. So now what we're naturally doing is giving it a gradient between light and dark rust. Then after just a few seconds that it's kind of dry, we're going to go back over it with some pigment and then put some more wash down. And what that's going to do is it's going to build up a texture. So you're actually going to get a rust texture because that pigment's not going to completely dissolve because we're not putting enough thinner down because it's thinner with pigment already in it in that wash. And it just leaves behind this beautiful rust gradient with texture. It's a two-step process at a minimum to get that texture to build up, but you can continue to put more and more layers down if you want to build up this effect. This is a really nice way to give a realistic texture of rust just using pigments and washes. So then we're going to move on to those gray parts that we painted earlier and put that same light rust wash down, and that again just makes it really look like weathered steel. So then we're going to switch over to some mud, and I want to try using this silicone brush, and it worked out really well versus a regular brush, because when you get into these textured paints, enamels in this case, it really wrecks a brush. So I definitely recommend using a silicone brush if you can. These are really easy to get a hold of. So you can see what I'm doing is just layering this stuff real thick, and this is meant to depict thick built up mud. Now because it's enamel mud, it takes a few hours to dry, and because it's very thick it takes a while too, so I moved on to the tracks at this point. So we're going to paint them dark tracks just like I normally do. For any of you guys that had seen me paint my Panther tank, you're going to see that this is pretty much the same exact process. We're just going to use some Europe earth and some farm dark earth over top of those painted tracks, again with dark tracks from ammo, and we're just going to add in these nice colors. Again, this just gives it that dusty, dirty feel. Now we're not going to be doing too much mud because you'll see as our reference photos show that as the Germans were testing these, they weren't super muddy. So the next thing we're going to do here after we have our pigments down is switch over to a dry brush, and we're going to add in this silver polished effect that happens on the tracks as they get used, right? So obviously as these tracks are running over harder objects such as stones, concrete, hard ground, that metal will actually wear and turn a nice bright silver, get it polished. Here you can see kind of before and after what it looks like. It just adds such a nice element of realism to it. And here you can see the tracks are on the tank. I did get these put into place, and they are fixed in place because these were individual links that went together, but they just snapped together. So you'll notice I didn't do any chipping on this tank because again it's a captured German tank, captured British tank by the Germans. What does that make it? A captured German tank or a captured British tank? Either way, it's captured. And it's been repainted. So these guys repainted it. So the paint would be pretty fresh. So what I wanted to do was just use a dry brushing technique to paint some chipping colors over top of areas that maybe have adjustment to them or have been touched. Basically, things that would have been just touched or used during general testing and training. So after we got that little bit of dry brushing done, I switched over to getting the decals on, which I kind of actually forgot to do. So if it seems a little out of place, it's because I actually forgot to go back and do this part. So using our Mr. Setter and Mr. Softer, just putting over these German decals, again, same as in the reference photo. I know you'll notice in the reference photos it actually had the larger German crosses on, but you can't fit them underneath those cleats. It just doesn't actually work. There's not actually a gap there. I scribed a gap, but it's not an actual gap. It's just a recess. So I couldn't fit them on. But what I wanted to do was go back over them with some matte varnish just over top of these decals to make sure that they are a flat matte finish and not shiny or silvery or anything like that. And then the next step here is I actually tried using some black pigments, but it didn't work the way I wanted, so I switched over to just a black air spray of paint and just tried to do a little bit of smoke at the exhaust. So the next step is to add a lot of dirt and dust onto the tank. So we're going to use the same exact pigments we used on the tracks, the Europe Earth, and we're going to just put this all over the sides of these tanks. They got very dusty and dirty. And we're going to do just as I did on the Panther. We're going to take a pipette with some enamel thinner and go over everything. Just kind of dabbing it, letting the enamel thinner flow out of the pipette, and that's going to set everything in place. And then the next step is to take a nice thin brush with enamel thinner, and we're going to swipe down, and that's actually going to clean the areas that we swipe. And what it's going to do is it's going to make it look like rain marks. So this next little trick is similar to what we did with the exhaust. We're building up a bunch of pigment in the recesses of the tank, and then we're going to soak it with enamel thinner, and that's going to fix it in place. And because we're not adding enough enamel thinner to completely dissolve it, it actually gives it a dirty texture right on top without having to use real dirt or anything, just pigments. And again, swiping some more. So it just turned out really, really well. All that dirt and pigments just looks so good on there. So moving on to our reference photo, I love this picture of this tank being tested. Again, I colorized this just so I could see it. So this is what we're using as our basis. We're just going to make a flat vignette with a concrete block. This is all out of foam that I had laying around in my little room here. And again, this is just showing the concept of what I want to do. So I got to use Smart Mud for the first time. Again, I really love a lot of the stuff that VMS offers. Their products are great, and this Smart Mud is no different. I will say, you notice it doesn't stick really well to flat foam, so you kind of have to have something maybe a little bit rougher, which I have an idea I'll talk about in the future, about my next plan for future bases. But in this case, we're putting Smart Mud over top of that white foam, and you can see the next step after we get the whole thing covered is to take the tank and just impress that into the Smart Mud. Now this Smart Mud takes a couple hours to dry, but you're going to want to impress your tank tracks into it pretty soon. And what I did was I kind of moved the tank around a little bit to make it look like it wasn't the first time a tank had come through this area. And this next little trick was I actually grabbed an old figure that I'd never painted from an old, I think it's an M48A3 set, one of my first models I ever made, and just imprinted a bunch of feet marks into the mud there. I thought it was a nice little touch. So then the concrete block I used some balsa wood just to kind of build those bump outs or whatever they were on the edge of that concrete block in the reference photo. I'm just trying to recreate that. I took some concrete acrylics by Ammo and put that on here. The texture turned out really, really well. It's just such a nice acrylic paint to put on there for texture. I added some ballast down over top of the Smart Mud, and then I came back with some diluted PVA later. I guess we'll get to that. In the meantime, I actually had cut and scored and then broke off this piece of I think it's veneer, but just like a couple of millimeter thick plywood that I actually found on Amazon. And then I used some double-sided tape to stick it on fast to the sides. Now, I did come back and clean up all the edges to make sure they were nice and flush and looked really nice, and I was really happy with it. But then the next step is to actually fill that gap with Smart Mud. So I took the Smart Mud and I went over the edge and filled in a little bit of a gap between the foam and the wood, and you can see how it makes it a completely seamless base just by filling that gap in with the Smart Mud. It just makes the scene feel like it goes on forever. So back to the PVA that I was talking about. I actually think I should have put it on when I mentioned it, but I actually forgot to, and I think at one point I dumped stones all over my, or I should say ballast all over my workbench, which I think you can see in this shot right here actually. So then it was time to test fit the tank to make sure that it actually was going to look right, and then once I did that, and I was happy with it, I put some toothpicks in that concrete and made holes for it, just so I knew I would always hit that spot. I just used toothpicks to line it up. And I put a stone underneath there to make sure that it had an angle, to it. It was being rolled over. So the next step was to add some static grass. Again, I just put some PVA glue down, that diluted glue, and then sprinkle grass over. And then I put these tufts down. So these tufts are actually probably about 3 inches long, and I cut them down to various lengths and then kind of bunch them up and set them down. And these are just like static grass, but they're just way too big for a static grass applicator. That, and again, they're very long strands. These are specifically meant to do what I was doing. So then the next step is to actually take some black primer and prime everything black. And this is one of those steps that like the first time I saw it, I was like, really, we're gonna paint everything black. But it actually really works. It brings out all the textures. And while I was painting it black, I noticed that I felt like there was not enough grass in that little corner, so I added some more tufts and then painted them over. And I tell you what, the black primer over a diorama really brings it all together. It's a really beautiful thing to see all those textures just pop. So now we're going to take this Dunkelgelb color and we're going to spray the grass and the tufts. And what this is going to do is kind of make it look like dried out grass. Really, that's what it is. We're going to add some highlights in as well. This is just to give some color variation to our dried out grass. Again, this is kind of a field, and you saw that colorized photo. It was like a dry grass. And we're going to add in some bright green just to give it a little bit of life. So again, look at grass most times of the year, especially like autumn and in the spring. You'll see early spring, wintertime, you'll see this yellowish, greenish color. And I thought it turned out really nice. So then we go back with Sand Growl, which is a really nice yellow-gray color, great rock color. We're just going to kind of almost like a zenithal from the top come in to make them like a natural highlight. And again, using that black primer undercoat to kind of create those fake shadows on the bottom. And then after that, we're going to come in with this Tamiya flat earth color. And this is, again, we had a black base, now we need to make it brown because the ground's not black. And remember, we have a very dusty tank, not muddy, but dusty. So we need to do a lot of earth tones, but on the lighter scale. So we're going to start with this medium gray, I would call it. And then we're going to switch over to Deck Tan. And as everyone knows, this is a very famous color for so many different uses. And I actually compared it to the Europe Earth pigment that I was using, and it's pretty darn close. So that's why I chose it. And we put this Deck Tan over top of all of the open areas that we want to highlight, and also over like the tops of the tracks and around the footprints. And it actually brings out the depth and the details. So the next step is I took 3 different colors of paint, and I just took a little while and painted all these different rocks. So one at a time, individually painting these rocks. And as gruesome as it might sound, it's not an overly long process, and it's actually kind of neat to watch it come together. So again, just taking 3 different colors over time and just painting all of the little rocks all over the base. And it just adds such a nice little pop of color, and it makes them really stand out on your vignette in this case. It's just an absolutely beautiful thing. So then we go back and we're going to take Sand Growl and we're going to go over the concrete. So remember I said it's a nice stone color. So again, nice stone color is a nice concrete color. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to take some Deck Tan and go over top of that just to kind of bring all of that color together that's already on the base. That, and there's a tank going over it, so we want to add a little bit of dust look, earth look to it. Then after we got that done, all the airbrush painting is done. We can take our masking off of the edges where we had the wood, and unfortunately I had some bleed through when I was using some PVA glue, but you can see I actually sanded it down and it took care of most of it, so it wasn't near as bad. And then I took this polyurethane and stain mix that I had in my garage from past woodworking projects and actually just stained the edges. I think it really brought it together. Unfortunately, it brought out some of that stuff I had sanded off earlier, but again, I think it turned out really well. Then I printed this faceplate on my 3D printer. It's an FDM printer, and after some suggestion from some friends, I decided to paint it brass as the base. So I actually painted the entire thing in this nice brass color. And then we're going to come back with a just black color and paint over the lettering. And that's just going to really bring this faceplate together and be a wonderful last addition to this beautiful build and a beautiful vignette worthy of the shelf. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you enjoy this reveal. thank you all so much for hanging in there till the end. If you liked what you see, please leave a comment, and if you want to see more, please subscribe. I literally have a wall of tanks to build and put onto bases such as this, so please, you don't want to miss future content. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.